Thank you, Elder Tom. If you have your Bibles with you, I invite you to open up with me to the book of Psalms. Our passage comes to us this morning from Psalm 23. And if I could kindly actually ask everyone to please stand for the reading of God's word as an act of reverence and as an act of worship. And I'll read this for us. Psalm 23, starting with verse 1. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Amen. This is God's word. Please be seated at this time. There's a story that I read online this past week as I was preparing this message about a Sunday school teacher who asked her class if anyone could recite by memory Psalm 23 in front of the class. And as the story goes, a little 4.5-year-old girl, she got up, she raised her hand, and the teacher called her up to the front of the class. And at first, the teacher was a bit skeptical. She wasn't sure that this little girl actually memorized all of Psalm 23. But the little girl went up to the front of the class, all confident, and she started speaking, and she said, "The Lord is my shepherd. That's all I want." And she takes a bow, and she goes and sits back down. Everyone claps for her. And, according to this article, that very well may be one of the most concise and yet at the same time profound interpretations of this passage and of this psalm. Psalm 23 is one of the most well-known psalms in the entire Psalter. It's one of the most well-known and famous chapters in all of the Bible. And it's a passage that's actually quite often used in funerals or in end-of-life scenarios when people are facing their mortality, they're facing the end of life. But what I hope that we can see here today as we look at this together is that Psalm 23 actually has a much broader application than just to people who are dying or people who are perhaps mourning the loss of loved ones, because Psalm 23 actually applies to really anyone in life who suffers difficulties. This passage applies really to anyone who in life is seeking to find contentment and find satisfaction in life. It applies to all the highs and lows of everyday life that all of us experience each day. And the question really that Psalm 23 lays out for us and answers for us, the question that it asks us and answers is, in the midst of all the stress and all the hardships, all the anxiety of your life, how can you actually still, in the midst of all that, how can you actually still have peace, and how can you still find contentment in life? And the way that Psalm 23 answers that question for us is through this imagery of a shepherd and his sheep. And it's through this image and this metaphor that this passage gives us essentially a picture of really how the Lord cares for and how he comforts his sheep. And so if you want to be able to go through the hardships of life, if you want to be able to find true contentment and peace through all of life's chaos, all the ups and downs that you may experience in life, Psalm 23 says the only way you can find it is in and through the Good Shepherd, through walking with him, through following him. And so what I'd like us to do in our time today as we look at this passage together and think about this is see, what is this shepherd like that we have in the Lord? Now, how is it that the Lord shepherds us as his people? And how does that allow us in our lives to get through the suffering and the hardship that we all may face one day or that we're facing even now? And so there are three things in this passage that it highlights about the Lord as our shepherd that I want us to see here today. Now, first, the Lord provides for his sheep. He provides for their needs. Secondly, the Lord protects his sheep. He protects them from danger and through the valley. And lastly, the Lord pursues his sheep with steadfast love. So again, the Lord provides for his sheep, he protects them, and he pursues them with his love. And so let's begin with the first point. The Lord provides. Now, before we actually get into this, I want to just provide, just very briefly, some background to the idea and this concept of shepherding. The imagery of a shepherd it's kind of lost on us modern people because when many of us, we hear the word shepherd, the first thing that might come to our mind is maybe the picture of a farmer or maybe a rancher even. And although we know what a shepherd is, we know what a shepherd does, The closest that most of us have actually gotten in real life to seeing a shepherd in action is probably a worker at the petting zoo or at the OC fair, someone just handling the sheep pen. But see, the difference is, in the Old Testament, shepherding was such a common practice because in an agricultural, in that more rural society, shepherds and sheep were everywhere. And so if you went to anyone, everyone would know exactly what a shepherd did, what he looked like, and what his life was like. And really, the primary responsibility of a shepherd back then, and even still now, was to care for his flock, was to care for his sheep. And that included everything from providing for them, feeding them with water, with food, maintaining their hygiene, cleaning their wool every single day, protecting them from threats and from danger, and even sleeping out in the field right next to the flock, right next to the sheep, to make sure that through the night, every single one of them was safe and they were secure. And for all the parents here, all these responsibilities, I'm sure they sound very familiar. Providing, feeding, cleaning, having to sleep next to your children at night. And it's important to think about this because shepherding, in a lot of ways, it is like parenting. And that's important for us to understand, and it's important for us to keep in mind as we think about this psalm and this passage, because when the psalmist here, when David says that the Lord is my shepherd, it's not so much this master-servant relationship, the sort of formal, hierarchical relationship, but it's much more intimate, and it's actually much more personal than that. There's this nurture, and there's this trust that defines and that characterizes this relationship between the shepherd and between his sheep. And that's why in verse 1, David begins with this famous phrase that we all know and love, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Now, I actually prefer Peter Craigie, he's an Old Testament scholar. I actually prefer his translation of verse 1, which actually goes like this: "So long as the Lord is my shepherd, I suffer no lack," or "I lack nothing." Now, what exactly does this mean? We've all grown up hearing this psalm. Perhaps some of us have memorized this. We've all heard verse 1 so many times in our lives, but what exactly does this mean? Well, first, David is not saying that if the Lord is our shepherd, that we'll never have any wants or desires in this world again, or that we'll never lack anything in our lives. I'm sure if I asked everyone in this room here, just grab a pen and paper and to just jot down things you feel that you lack in your life, I'm pretty sure that it'd be easy for many of us to fill up that list very quickly. Now, what verse 1 really is it's two things. First, it's a statement about the Lord's faithfulness. Now, if the Lord is my shepherd, I won't lack anything. Because as a shepherd, the Lord provides me with not what I want, not everything that I feel that I need, but the Lord provides me with what's best for me. The Lord provides me with what He knows that I need. And see, in that sense, if the Lord is my shepherd, I won't lack. He'll give me everything He knows that I need. It's a statement really about God's wisdom and His faithfulness in providing everything His sheep need. But see, at the very same time, on the other hand, it's also a declaration of David's contentment, his own personal sense of satisfaction in life. If the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not lack. I'll be content. Why? Because the Lord Himself, what He provides for me and where He leads me, that's enough to satisfy me. That's enough to have me be content in this life. That's what David is saying here in verse 1. Now, friends, I understand and I get it too. Oftentimes, when we read a statement like this in the Bible, there's this disconnect between our own experience in life and what the passage is saying. In this case, the Lord is my shepherd, I won't lack anything. I won't want. Now, how often do we actually feel that way if we're honest with ourselves? How often can we actually say that with a clear conscience and honestly and sincerely? One of the reasons why we don't experience this fully in our lives is oftentimes because the Lord isn't our shepherd. He's not the one we're following. He's not the one we're listening to. He's not the one we're walking beside and following. But oftentimes, instead, we're following shepherds other than the Lord. We're listening to their voice, and that's why so often in our lives we feel like we lack. If only I got a better, higher-paying job, if only I got into this certain school, then I'd finally feel set. I'd finally feel content and happy and satisfied. If only I entered into this relationship with this other person, if only my marriage would improve a little bit, then I'd finally feel like I won't lack. Like I don't need anything else in my life to improve. If only my kids would become as successful and as accomplished as I want them to, then I'd finally feel fulfilled. I'd finally feel satisfied as a parent and as a person. Brothers and sisters, the reality is many of us, we live as if we lack so much in life, and we feel as if we lack so much in life. And we're constantly trying so desperately to fill those areas and fill those things that we feel are lacking. And the application that we can draw here from Psalm 23 is this. What you feel you constantly lack in your life, that may be indicative of the shepherd that you are actually following, the person or the thing that you have set as the shepherd in your life. What you feel you constantly are lacking in, that may be actually the shepherd of your life. Whether it's money, whether it's success or relationship, whatever it is, if in your life, if you think about your own life, if you always have this constant feeling of lack, if you always live each day with this constant feeling of discontentment, like you're always just waiting for that one next big, exciting event or thing to happen to you or in your life, if you're always just waiting for that, that may mean that you are not following and setting the Lord as your shepherd, but actually instead you are following the voice and you're following the leading of a false shepherd. A shepherd who will lead you down this perpetual cycle of discontentment and lack in your life, and this feeling that it's never enough, I always need more. There's a song entitled Messiah by a group called Beautiful Eulogy that I think some of the lyrics really capture so beautifully this struggle and this tension that so many of us live with each and every day in our lives. And a few lines from the song go like this. The saddest fact is that I search for satisfaction as if I lack it when in fact I lack nothing. That's the reason for my lackluster prayer life and my lust for distractions. Friends, all of us search for satisfaction. We all search for contentment in life. But for believers, the danger and the temptation is we do so as if we don't already have the one thing that will actually satisfy us. We live as if we don't have it already. And because we're constantly chasing after distractions in our lives and false shepherds, we're always left feeling empty. We're always left feeling lacking. But see, for David, in this psalm, for David, if God is his shepherd, he's content. He doesn't lack. He's completely satisfied. Because as the shepherd, God provides everything that he knows David needs. And that's exactly what verses 2 and 3 of our passage really paint for us a picture of. You know, verses 2 and 3 in this passage show us how the Lord provides for his people and for his sheep. You know, in verse 2, he provides them with green pastures to eat, with still waters to drink from. In verse 3, he provides them with rest for their souls. He guides them in right paths for his own name and his own glory. And really what these verses are, what verses 2 and 3 are, is they're almost an idyllic picture of provision and abundance. You know, we don't have time to look at every single detail in verses 2 and 3, but let me just focus here on these green pastures. You know, in the modern day area of Palestine, the area which David would have lived in, the area in which David would have shepherded in, that area is known for being extremely arid and extremely harsh. And so typically, shepherds in that area, after they find a patch of grass for their flock to graze in, they have to keep moving from place to place because the grass is so sparse. There's not enough grass for all the sheep to keep feeding in. And after the sheep graze once, they already have to leave because there isn't enough grass. And so they're constantly on the move. It's this transient lifestyle. They're always moving from place to place to place to find more food. But if you notice, the picture in verse 2 here that David paints for us, it's the complete opposite. Verse 2 says, he makes me lie down in green pastures. Not just stop to eat or graze, stop for a bite and then move on, but he makes me lie down in green pastures. This is really a picture, and it applies a picture of abundance. There's more than enough to provide what the sheep need. There's more than enough for multiple meals. They don't have to keep moving anymore. They can stay here, they can rest, they can eat. And what these verses are communicating to us, brothers and sisters, is the Lord's ability to provide for and to satisfy his sheep. to satisfy us as his people. And see, the person who understands and the person who takes to heart what these verses are saying, that is a person who will actually be able to find true contentment in life. Because when the Lord is your shepherd, and when you begin to understand and realize in your own life how the Lord abundantly and faithfully is able to provide for you and satisfy all the longings of your soul, the deepest longings of your soul, only then will you be able to find true contentment and true satisfaction in your life. And you'll be able to say with David, if the Lord is my shepherd, if he is the one that I'm walking with each day, if he's the one that I'm following on these paths, I will not lack. I'll be satisfied. I'll be content. And this brings us to our second point. You know, the Lord, he not only provides for his sheep, but he also protects his sheep. And one of the beautiful things, really, about Psalm 23 here is it's not only that it's so vivid in its imagery and in its language and how it describes the Lord and how he is as a shepherd, but Psalm 23 is also so beautiful because it's very honest and it's very realistic in the way it depicts life under the shepherd. You know, because the psalm itself, it acknowledges that a life of following the shepherd, a life of following Christ, it's not always going to be green pastures and still waters. The psalm itself acknowledges that the paths of righteousness that verse 3 talks about, the paths that the Lord leads us on, oftentimes, it's not all paradise, but oftentimes it's filled with hardship, it's filled with difficulty, and it's filled with suffering. And that's why David says here in verse 4, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Now that phrase, valley of the shadow of death, that's one of the reasons why Psalm 23 is such a popular psalm to use and read during funerals or during end-of-life scenarios when people are near the brink of death. But the phrase itself is actually, it's much broader than just death. Now, the phrase itself in Hebrew literally means darkest valley or valley of deep shadow. And see, what that means for us is it expands the application of this psalm, of Psalm 23, to really any form of fear or distress that we may face in life. It can include death, of course, but it's not just limited to death. It can actually apply much more generally to any of the hardships and the difficulties that you and I may face in our life each day. And the first thing this shows us and reveals to us is that trusting God in our shepherd, brothers and sisters, it doesn't exempt us from dark valleys and from suffering in this life. Not only does God make us lie down in green pastures, not only does he lead us by the still waters, but the Lord actually leads us many times through valleys in life. And really, one of the questions that's so commonly asked and raised by many Christians is why? Why does the Lord allow us to suffer? If God is such a good God, if God is such a good shepherd, why does he allow me to suffer? Why is this happening in my life right now? And brothers and sisters, what Psalm 23, at the very least, what it tells us is the reason why we go through valleys in life and experience suffering is because the Lord is ultimately the one who leads us and guides us and takes us through and comforts us through those valleys. That in some mysterious way, God is able even to use our suffering and our valleys in life for his glory and for our own good. As one pastor has said, one of the reasons that God leads us through suffering in life is to change us. Because what suffering does in and to our lives is suffering shakes our lives up. In some way, it almost awakens us from this spiritual stupor, this spiritual slumber that many of us fall into. Because when suffering hits, when it shakes the very core and the very foundation of your life, when suffering happens, we start to lose control. And we start to lose our sense of control over our life, and we start to loosen our grip on all the things that we hang on to so dearly. And we start to loosen our grip on all the shepherds, all the false idols that we hold to so tightly until it gets to the point where there's nothing else to cling to, there's nothing else to hold on to except the one true shepherd that we have. Brothers and sisters, what suffering does in our lives is it pushes us, it nudges us, it pushes us to gently cling to the only shepherd who can actually provide comfort and protection for our lives in the first place through our valleys. And the person who has truly set the Lord as their shepherd, that person will be able to walk through the valleys and the suffering of their life, that person will be able to face their fears and to face their anxieties because of the shepherd, because the shepherd is walking with them. See, most people, everyone here included probably, most people, when they're faced with suffering, when they're faced with valleys in their lives, they usually take one of two paths or one of two options. Now, some people, they're more passive. They don't really like conflict. They can't handle any sort of stressful situation. And so these people, their tendency is to try to basically run away from their problems. When they're going through a valley situation in life, their tendency is just to take a 180-degree turn and just escape it, just avoid it at all costs. Or their tendency is to try and avoid it altogether in the first place. That's one group of people. Another group of people, they're the opposite. They're a bit more assertive. They're more control-oriented. And so these people, when they're faced with valleys and when they're faced with hardships in life, they do the opposite. They're all about manipulating and controlling their situation. What do I need to do to fix my circumstances? What do I need to do right now to get myself out of this valley that I've fallen into, this valley that I've gotten into? Now, whichever tendency, if you think about your own life, whatever tendency that you may lean towards or that you may gravitate towards more, both of these approaches to handling suffering, if you think about it, they're all based on your circumstances. You're either trying to avoid bad circumstances, run away from bad circumstances, or you're always just trying to manipulate and control your circumstances. But if you notice, if you look at Psalm 23 hardly even mentions the circumstances at all. It doesn't go into any detail. All it says is, even if I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, what? Not, I'll try and run out of the valley, or I'll try and avoid the valley in the first place. I'll turn around and go back. Not, I'll try and forge and find my own way out, or on my own path out of the valley. But I will fear no evil. Why? Because you are with me. Because you are with me. Notice there's a turn here in the psalm and how David addresses the Lord. And in the first 3 verses of this psalm, the Lord has always been addressed in the third person. The Lord is my shepherd. He's my shepherd. He's the one that leads me. He's the one that guides me. He's the one who feeds me. But now here in verse 4, David shifts and takes a turn to the second person. He doesn't say, the Lord is with me in the valley, but he says, you are with me. It's a prayer. It's direct. There's this personal presence with the Lord that David experiences and he feels in the midst of his valley, in the midst of his suffering. So much so that David's comfort here in verse 4, it doesn't come from avoiding hardships. It doesn't come from changing his circumstances and controlling his situation. But David's comfort here comes only from the fact that the shepherd is walking alongside him, that the shepherd is with him. For you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. The presence of the shepherd, the instruments that he uses to fight off the sheep's enemies, his rod, the instruments that he uses to guide his sheep through the valley, his staff, those things are the basis for David's confidence and his comfort in his valley. And brothers and sisters, what this means for us is this. Now, you cannot manage and you cannot handle your fears and your anxieties that you face in life externally. Now, you can't do it through avoiding or changing your circumstances. Fear, worry, anxiety, these are all internal. These are all heart and gospel issues. These are things that the gospel needs to speak into, and these are things that the Holy Spirit needs to work within your heart. And so the question for us, as we think about this and think about our own lives is, what is it when you're going through a valley, when you're going through suffering in your life, who or what do you turn to for comfort? Now, when you're going through immense suffering or some sort of valley situation, what's the first thing that you naturally gravitate towards to look to for peace and a sense of comfort in your life? Now, for most of us, it's actually probably the same false shepherds and the same idols that we turn to for contentment and satisfaction in our lives. And for example, if your marriage isn't going well, perhaps, maybe you perhaps take solace, you find comfort in the fact that, well, I know my marriage isn't going well, but at least my kids are doing okay. They're succeeding in school. They're excelling in their sports, their activities. Maybe when your relationships aren't really panning out in your life, you might find foundation, you might find comfort in your life, perhaps in your job or your financial security, your grades, your academics. Whatever it is for you in your life, brothers and sisters, this is the point. The only thing that'll really get you through the valleys of your life, that can actually carry you through and comfort you in the midst of your suffering, is if you set the Lord as your shepherd and that you truly find comfort in him. That you find your comfort not in your circumstances, but in the fact that the shepherd is walking alongside you in the valley. Several years ago, my mother was actually diagnosed with a brain aneurysm, and it was a huge scare for our entire family. I was in college at that point. I think I was a sophomore at the time. But eventually, we were really worried. We thought that it could be some sort of cancer. She was having a lot of dizziness and headaches for a really, really long time. And eventually the doctors, they were able to run enough tests and enough scans, and they found out that it was a brain aneurysm. But I remember during all the initial testing and just during that initial period of just uncertainty and confusion and being scared, our entire family was so worried. But I remember my mom was, as usual, she was so strong and she was so brave. And I remember one day talking with her, and she said to me, "Hey, Andrew, it's going to be all right. It's going to be okay no matter what happens, because I know God is with me. Because I know he's with me." See, it was so simple for her. It was almost too simple for her. And I really was so encouraged and inspired by her faith. But for me, in that moment, I knew she was right. But for me, in that moment, helplessly watching my mom, not being able to do a thing, not knowing what's going to happen to her, it didn't feel like it was enough. I didn't just want God to be with my mom. I didn't just want God to walk with her through the valley. I wanted him to take this valley away. I wanted him to change the situation or take this whole situation away. But looking back in hindsight, I realize now that what my mom was doing in that period of her life was she was walking through the valley with the Good Shepherd. Because her comfort and that peace that she had in her life, which I lacked so desperately, it didn't come from the medications, it didn't come from the test results or her circumstances, but it came from the simple fact that the Lord as her shepherd was walking alongside her each step of the way. And friends, that is how the Lord protects his sheep. Not by exempting them from suffering, not by sheltering them from experiencing suffering in their lives, but through leading them, through comforting them, and through walking alongside them and being present with them through the valleys that they go through in their lives. That is how the Lord protects and comforts his sheep. And this brings us briefly to our last point. And if you look with me at verse 5, the psalm shifts here in verse 5 from the image of a shepherd to the image of a host. And David says in verse 5 of the psalm, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows." Now, if you notice, what verse 5 does here in this passage is it almost restates and it almost recaptures all the verses in the psalm that came before it, verses 1 through 4. But it does so now through this image and this picture of a host and his guest sitting at a banqueting table or sitting around this feast. And as a host, the Lord continues to provide for David, not only through leading him by still waters and green pastures, but through hospitality, through anointing and washing his head with oil, through filling his cup to the point of overflowing. As a host, the Lord continues to protect David, not just through leading and guiding him through the valleys of his life, but through sheltering him and protecting him from the presence of his enemies. And because of David's experience here in verse 5 and verses 1 through 4, because of David's experience of the Lord's provision and his protection over his life, not just as a shepherd, but also as a host, that gives David confidence to say and proclaim with confidence and assurance what he says in verse 6. "Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever." Now, in the Hebrew there, that word for follow in verse 6, it's actually a much stronger word than to follow, because the word to follow it's more casual and it's more passive, but the word they're used for follow is actually a word that means to pursue. It means literally to chase after something or chase after someone relentlessly. And friends, this has to be, and it may be, one of the most comforting and reassuring aspects of having the Lord as our shepherd and of Psalm 23 as a whole. Because it means that because God has shown to us his goodness and his faithfulness in the past, because we've tasted and experienced the Lord's goodness and faithfulness, what this means is we can know with confidence, we can know with assurance, whatever happens in our lives, that the Lord will continue to show us his goodness and continue to show us his faithfulness. That even when we fail to completely and wholeheartedly follow the Lord, even when we may wander from the path that he set for us, and even when each day we may struggle and chase after all the false idols, the false shepherds that we have in our own lives, what this means is that the Lord's goodness and his steadfast love continues to pursue us, continues to pursue and chase after his wandering and his wayward sheep that you and I are. And the greatest expression of that pursuing love that God has for us is in the gospel. Because ultimately, brothers and sisters, the shepherd that Psalm 23 describes for us, and the shepherd that it points to, is none other than Jesus Christ. Because Jesus is the shepherd who in Matthew 18, he is the shepherd who goes after and chases after and pursues that one sheep out of the 99 who wanders off the path to bring back into the fold. Brothers and sisters, Christ is the shepherd who in John 10, he's the good shepherd who not only provides for his sheep everything they need, who not only protects them through the valley, but he is the good shepherd who lays down his very own life for the sheep. Friends, Jesus is the ultimate shepherd because he saved his sheep by actually becoming one of his sheep. Jesus, as the shepherd, became the lamb who was slain upon the cross for the sins of his people. Jesus is the shepherd who didn't just comfort and guide his people through the valley of the shadow of death, but Christ is the shepherd who himself walked into, and entered into the valley of the shadow of death so that all who put their faith in him could come out alive. And as we close, brothers and sisters, what this means for us is this. Because Christ is our shepherd, because he laid down his life for us, and because we know that the Lord pursues his sheep with steadfast love, we can say with David the last line of this psalm. Because we know that the Lord pursues us, we know that we'll persevere to the end. We know that whatever valleys and sufferings and hardships that we face in this life, we'll know that we'll make it through those trials and those valleys because the Lord is with us. And we know that we'll ultimately, in the end, we'll dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Not because of how perfectly we follow and we obey and listen to the Good Shepherd, but because of how relentlessly and how faithfully the Lord as our shepherd pursues us with his grace.